On May 29, 1982, a gruesome discovery was made in a remote area of Loxahatchee, Florida. In a shallow grave, investigators found a green nylon bag containing the skeletal remains of a young female. The condition of the remains immediately indicated foul play. Crucially, the perpetrator had sliced off the victim's fingertips, an apparent attempt to prevent identification. This chilling detail led detectives to initially believe that the perpetrator likely knew the victim and feared being linked to the crime if her body were identified. At the scene, authorities also recovered personal items: a digital watch and a pair of handmade post-type earrings, crafted from 2 pennies minted in 1979. Local law enforcement and the medical examiner began working to learn who this young woman was and what had happened to her. The Palm Beach County medical examiner examined the remains, which were in an advanced state of decomposition, and noted no immediate cause of death on the skeleton. The manner of death was presumed to be a slaying given the circumstances, and investigators combed through the additional clues, but nothing turned up. The location was semi-rural and sparsely developed at the time, offering the perp the seclusion to hide the crime. Investigators painstakingly compared the recovered skeletal profile against over 1,000 missing person cases nationwide, hoping to find a match, but every comparison came up empty. With no identity and no witnesses, the case of this Loxahatchee Jane Doe grew cold, and the victim remained nameless for many years. Unbeknownst to Palm Beach County authorities, about 18 months before the Loxahatchee remains were found, a 17-year-old girl named Tina Beebe had vanished. Tina was living with her family in the Fort Myers area when, on January 20th, 1981, she suddenly went missing. In the days before her disappearance, Tina had shared an excited story with her older sister, Holly. According to a later interview with Holly, Tina came home and excitedly told her sister that she had met a big-time modeling scout. This man had approached Tina with the promise of a job as a model, a dream opportunity for the teenager. Tina left home, ostensibly to pursue this offer, and her family never saw her again. At the time, Tina's disappearance was a mystery. There were no obvious signs of abduction at her home, and friends initially wondered if she might have run off to start a modeling career. Tina's family were convinced something was wrong. A dark development soon appeared to confirm the family's fears. The day after Tina vanished, one of her acquaintances was brutally slain. Tina had been friends with 27-year-old Harvey Michael McElroy, a known enforcer for a local gang who had recently escaped prison. McElroy was found slain, and his body burned in an apparent gangland slaying. This raised disturbing questions about Tina's fate. Investigators in Southwest Florida considered the possibility that Tina might have gotten entangled in McElroy's dangerous world. There was even speculation that Tina had been working for McElroy, perhaps in some illicit capacity, and that the same gang may have eliminated her to tie up loose ends. Notably, this gang had a reputation for extreme violence and was also confirmed to have slain numerous other people in the area at the time. These leads were tenuous and difficult to prove, but they show that early on, law enforcement did consider a gang connection in Tina Beebe's case. Still, with no body and no solid evidence of what happened to Tina in 1981, her case in Fort Myers went cold, much like the unidentified remains case did in Palm Beach County. For decades, the mystery of the Loxahatchee Jane Doe and the disappearance of Tina Beebe remained unsolved puzzles running in parallel, unknown to each other. By the early 2000s, the unidentified remains from Loxahatchee were stored among dozens of other cold cases at the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's Office. In 2013, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office decided to take a fresh look at its Jane Doe cases. A forensic artist began creating facial reconstructions and circulating details in hopes of generating new leads. One day, Holly, Tina's sister, happened to hear about an unidentified female body found on Florida's East Coast years ago. Holly's intuition immediately told her this could be her sister. She immediately rushed into action and contacted the sheriff's office to explain about Tina. When Holly reached an investigator and began describing her sister's case, the officer realized exactly which cold case she was referring to. Holly sent the sheriff's office a photograph of Tina, and the forensic artist compared it to the skull of the Jane Doe he had worked with to create the sketch. The skull's facial structure showed a unique asymmetry, which appeared to be shared by Tina. Experts also noted that the Jane Doe's teeth and Tina's dental records lined up perfectly. After 31 years of anonymity, the young woman in the shallow grave finally had a name. In July 2013, authorities officially confirmed that the Loxahatchee remains were identified as Tina Marie Beebe, who had been just 17 years old at the time. They now knew for certain Tina had been deceased all those years. But this gave rise to two important questions. Who had slain her, and why? With Tina Beebe's identity restored, detectives could finally piece together her last known movements and pursue suspects. The circumstances of her disappearance immediately drew attention to one infamous criminal, Christopher Wilder. Wilder was an Australian-American serial perpetrator who lived in South Florida and in 1984 embarked on a cross-country crime spree targeting young women. He would pose as a photographer or modeling agent to lure victims with promises of careers, then abduct them and commit horrific acts to them. In the span of early 1984, Wilder ended the lives of at least 8 women across the U.S. before he died in a police shootout. Since his death, Wilder has been suspected in numerous unsolved cases of young women, especially those who had modeling or acting aspirations. Several facts in Tina's case point eerily toward Wilder's modus operandi. Tina disappeared after telling her sister about a man offering her a modeling job, which is exactly the kind of bait Wilder used on his victims. Additionally, Tina's remains were found not far from a property in Loxahatchee, which Wilder owned. In fact, just months after Tina's body was discovered, another potential victim of his, Leona Keller, was found in the same area. Notably, though, it's important to remember that Leona herself has never been conclusively tied to Wilder. It's important to note that Wilder was active in Florida from 1981 to 1984, and Tina's case fits a pattern. However, all the confirmed cases associated with him are from 1984, though the authorities suspect he had engaged in his sick predation for many years longer. If Wilder was indeed responsible for Tina's slaying, any real justice will be elusive, given the fact that he's been deceased for decades. The other theory that has lingered is the earlier gang connection. Was Tina collateral damage in a criminal underworld feud? Tina's friendship with Harvey McElroy and the timing of his gang-related slaying raised suspicions that she might have been silenced by the same crew in January 1981. The fact that Tina's fingers were chopped to hide her identity potentially suggests a gangland slaying by people who were concerned she would be tied back to McElroy. Further yet, Christopher Wilder wasn't known to have committed this act with his other victims, despite committing unspeakable horrors towards them. However, the gang theory is largely speculative and has never been proven. No direct evidence tying the gang to Tina's death has surfaced publicly. From my perspective, the theory involving Christopher Wilder feels far more convincing. The evidence of Tina's sister is simply too strong to ignore. Wilder was infamous for exactly that method, using the irresistible promise of modeling contracts to lure young women into his trap. It's eerie to think Tina excitedly shared this opportunity with her sister, completely unaware she was likely speaking to the man who would end her life the next day. The timing aligns so perfectly that it's hard to overlook. Wilder lived in Florida at the exact same period, living essentially next to the property where her body was found. Additionally, the location where Tina's remains were found further strengthens this suspicion. That said, the location of Tina's remains could have been a coincidence. Further, it's always possible that someone else who meant to do her harm also promised her a modeling gig, perhaps in an attempt to get Tina in an isolated one-on-one setting. That is to say, promising someone a modeling job isn't the most unique modus operandi in existence. In fact, the idea is so common that the idea of a creepy guy posing as a modeling agent or photographer has become a common trope in pop culture. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy just shouting out my two other channels, Lazy Chill History and Lazy Chill True Crime. The first focuses on historical content and mysteries, while the second focuses on solved cases. Anyway, let's get back to business. Patricia Campbell was a 15-year-old girl from Pocatello, Idaho, who vanished on July 22, 1978, during a Community Pioneer Day celebration at Alameda Park. She was last seen with her friend, 12-year-old Tina Anderson, enjoying the festivities that summer evening. When Tina failed to show up for a scheduled babysitting job across from the park that night, the girls' families reported them missing. Initially, authorities treated the girls as possible runaways, a common assumption at the time, but this theory would soon collapse as evidence of foul play emerged. 3 years later, in October 1981, hunters stumbled upon human remains in a remote brushy hillside area about 60 miles from Pocatello in rural Oneida County. Investigators arriving on the scene discovered scattered bones and a skull with a small hole in it. They also discovered deteriorated clothing matching what Patricia and Tina had been wearing when they disappeared. Spent shell casings were also recovered at the site, a grim indication of their violent end. The remains were identified as belonging to two young females, and one set was positively identified through dental records as Tina Anderson. The other bones were strongly suspected to be Patricia Campbell's, given that both girls had disappeared together. But at the time, in 1981, there was not enough evidence to conclusively identify Patricia's remains. The then technically unidentified victim, later confirmed to be Patricia, also showed signs of severe blunt force trauma to the head. The discovery of the bodies definitively ended any speculation that the girls were runaways. The case of Patricia Campbell and Tina Anderson presented immediate challenges to the authorities. Perhaps most obviously, the initial assumption that they were runaways may have resulted in significant evidence being forever lost to time. And stay tuned, because it'll become apparent shortly that the initial investigation was extremely questionable, even according to the authorities themselves. Because the remains were found in Oneida County, outside of Pocatello's jurisdiction, multiple law enforcement agencies became involved. Investigators back in 1978 had few solid leads. However, through interviews, they learned the two girls had left Alameda Park at one point on July 22nd with some acquaintances. According to witness reports later uncovered, Patricia and Tina, along with a few other local youths, visited a nearby house during the festival. From there, they then rode in a pickup truck with several adults to an area known as Moonlight Mine Road, a popular party spot for teens at the time. Those adults told police they had driven the girls back to the park after the outing, and neither girl was seen again after that. These circumstances suggest the girls perhaps initially willingly accompanied people they thought they knew, rather than being abducted by a stranger off the street. This would become a key point in the investigation, steering some investigators to suspect someone in the girls' social circle rather than an unknown predator. Despite those early leads, no arrests were made in the initial years. Years later, the investigation gained new momentum, and the scarcity of initial investigative materials was noted. In 2002, Oneida County Sheriff's Deputy Patsy Sherman took it upon herself to re-examine the cold case. She was shocked to find that the entire case file was made up of a large envelope and some physical evidence that had been preserved. Sherman spent years coordinating with multiple agencies and tracking down old witnesses, gradually expanding the case file. A major break came in 2007 when a joint task force of officers from 5 agencies and 3 counties was formed to excavate and reinvestigate the crime scene. In May 2007, detectives returned to the rural canyon where the remains had been found and unearthed a key piece of evidence that had been missed. They didn't publicly reveal what this item was, but investigators described it as directly linked to a suspect that hadn't been publicly named. Around the same time, an Idaho prison inmate provided new information about possible suspects, further energizing the inquiry. However, again, it's unclear what specific evidence came from this, and if that evidence has been able to further these cases. Another crucial development in 2007 was in forensic identification. Investigators realized that confirming the identity of the second body was vital. The Oneida County Sheriff's Office located Patricia's presumed remains, which had been misplaced in evidence storage for years, and submitted them for DNA testing. In March 2007, nearly 29 years after Patricia had gone missing, modern DNA analysis finally confirmed that those remains were Patricia Campbell's, as was long believed. In a parallel twist, additional remains had been found in the area years after the initial discovery. In October 1986, a hunter found a partial human skull in the same 2-mile canyon area of Oneida County. At the time, forensic experts were unsure if this skull was related to Patricia and Tina's case. Early anthropological analysis of the skull suggested an adolescent female of around 16 years old. Crucially, this anthropologist identified the remains as being from someone of likely mixed racial ancestry, which didn't match with Patricia. As a result, Patricia was considered and then ruled out as the identity of the skull back in the 1980s. Investigators believed it might belong to a third unidentified victim, colloquially dubbed the Oneida County Jane Doe. Unfortunately, this skull too was mishandled. It was sent for testing and then lost in transit between labs and evidence rooms, remaining missing for decades. It finally resurfaced in 2018, giving detectives another chance to identify the skull, but I'll come back to this in a moment. By 2016, authorities felt they were closing in on the culprits. The Oneida County Sheriff's Office announced publicly that year that the case was essentially solved, at least in theory. Investigators were confident they knew who the perpetrators were, the motive, and how the slayings occurred. However, this announcement came with a major caveat. Some key physical evidence had been lost over time, leaving their case strong but largely circumstantial. In 2017, Oneida County's prosecutor announced that due to the lack of available evidence needed for trial, he was handing the case back to investigators for further work. He noted that certain evidence had deteriorated or disappeared, making it impossible to meet the burden of proof in court. By way of reminder, and why this is so important, the prosecution, as a general rule, only has one shot on a charge, so they need to come prepared with their best possible evidence. Still, this was a frustrating setback, even though law enforcement believed they had identified more than one suspect responsible for the disturbing acts. A major breakthrough in the forensic side of the case came in recent years. With the skull from 1986 back in hand as of 2018, the Sheriff's Office partnered with advanced DNA specialists to finally put the Oneida Jane Doe question to rest. In 2021, the Sheriff's Office teamed up with Othram, a private laboratory specializing in forensic genealogy, to attempt to identify the skull using cutting-edge techniques. Othram scientists successfully extracted DNA from the degraded skull fragments and performed forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a comprehensive genetic profile. This proprietary method was used to create a genealogical profile and match this Jane Doe to Patricia Campbell. Importantly for the investigation, this reshaped the narrative of the case by clarifying that there weren't more victims in that canyon. Over the years, investigators and local residents have formulated several theories about who was responsible for the slayings of Patricia Campbell and Tina Anderson, and why. Between 1978 and 1983, at least 4 teenage girls in the region were abducted and slain under mysterious circumstances. All were students around the same age, many from the same school, and all vanished in or near Pocatello. It's been speculated that given the fact that this is an area with a small population, the odds of these cases being unrelated is infinitesimal. Early on, Ted Bundy was even speculated to have been involved in the slayings of these 2 girls, but Bundy was confirmed to be elsewhere by 1978. More likely, any serial involvement would point to a local culprit or culprits operating in southeastern Idaho in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Speculation has long focused on the adults who were last seen with Patricia Campbell and Tina Anderson. To address the elephant in the room, the very idea that these fully grown adults were taking these 2 girls to a quote-unquote party spot has obviously set off alarm bells. It's long been speculated that they may have also been providing them with substances as well. Independent witnesses confirmed the girls willingly accompanied these individuals in a pickup truck to Moonlight Mine Road, a popular hangout for teens. Although the adults insisted they'd return the girls safely to Alameda Park, neither Patricia nor Tina was seen again afterward, casting doubt on their account. With circumstantial evidence pointing toward familiarity rather than random abduction, these adults are believed by many to be those who are still under scrutiny by the authorities. At present, it's unclear if any potential DNA evidence of the perpetrator or perpetrators has been found or preserved. If it has, given the ability to recover significantly degraded DNA, and given the power of genetic genealogy, those responsible for these heinous acts shouldn't rest too easy. Judge John Fairbanks was a pillar of the small town of Newport, New Hampshire. A lifelong resident of the area, Fairbanks had served on the Newport District Court bench for over 30 years. He also ran a successful private law practice specializing in handling wills, estates, and trust funds for local families. To neighbors and colleagues, he was known as honest and helpful, often assisting widows and overseeing the finances of those who trusted him implicitly. Beneath that respected image, however, Fairbanks was hiding a devastating secret. For years, he had been siphoning money from the very clients who relied on his integrity. So gather around while I tell you the twisted tale of Justice Fairbanks, a local judge who broke bad and left behind more questions than answers. In August 1987, one of Fairbanks's longtime clients, Patricia Sawyer, entrusted him with her stock certificates as part of updating her will. She had been relying on Fairbanks for financial advice since her husband's death decades earlier. But after the stock market crash on October 19, 1987, the infamous Black Monday, Patricia noticed something alarming. Her regular dividend checks stopped arriving. When she pressed Fairbanks for answers, he brushed her off with a convoluted explanation. He claimed the crash had hurt the value of her stocks and said he was withholding her dividend checks to prevent further losses, an excuse that did little for her growing concern. Around the same time, another client began to question Fairbanks's handling of funds. John Tweedy, who had made Judge Fairbanks the legal guardian of his mentally incapable brother's trust, met with the judge in late 1988 and felt something was deeply wrong. Fairbanks evaded Tweedy's questions about the status of the trust accounts, raising red flags. Determined to get answers, Tweedy launched his own inquiry into the records. What he found was disturbing: stock sales that didn't add up, and dividend payments that were far lower than they should have been. In total, at least $20,000 was unaccounted for in his brother's fund. Armed with evidence of apparent theft, Tweedy went to the police and reported Judge Fairbanks in early 1989. Law enforcement investigators soon discovered that these were not isolated incidents. As they dug into Fairbanks's finances, they were astonished at what they found. Despite the judge earning a substantial sum of money, they found that he was living far beyond his means in a way that was completely incomprehensible. To give just one example, it turned out Fairbanks owned numerous lavish houses. This lifestyle only made sense if he had an income well above his judicial appointment and the income he derived from his small part-time law practice. However, even then, he had his defenders, with many believing he was simply a brilliant investor, or that perhaps he had more family money than he had let on. But then things started to get even more suspicious, and he began to take actions which would alarm even his supporters. In June 1989, under growing scrutiny, the 66-year-old Fairbanks abruptly resigned his judgeship after more than 3 decades on the bench. He retreated to his summer house in Maine, while authorities expanded their investigation into his client accounts. Once John Tweedy's accusations became public, the floodgates opened. Other clients of Fairbanks came forward with their own tales of missing money. Patricia Sawyer herself discovered that Fairbanks had been moving her assets without permission. By the time she confronted the truth, Patricia had lost an estimated $500,000 of her investments to Fairbanks's dealings. Case by case, the pattern became clear. Judge Fairbanks had been systematically draining the accounts of the people who trusted him. The judge had specialized in quote-unquote helping widows and disabled people, a fact which he was lauded for. However, in retrospect, this almost certainly meant that this financial predator likely saw these people as vulnerable prey to take advantage of. By late 1989, investigators concluded that Fairbanks's embezzlement was staggering in scope. For perhaps 20 years, he had been stealing his clients' funds to enrich himself. Early estimates put the theft at about $1.8 million over a 6-year period. But as more victims emerged, authorities feared the true total was far higher. Some investigators believed he had stolen upwards of $10 million through dozens of fraudulent transactions over 2 decades. Since the thefts occurred over the course of 20 years, it's impossible to say what the inflation-adjusted value of this was. However, even if we assume every cent was stolen in 1989, which it wasn't, this amount is still $25 million adjusted for inflation. The respected local judge had, in essence, robbed his community on a massive scale. In the fall of 1989, the New Hampshire Attorney General's office prepared to bring Fairbanks to justice. Investigators even spoke with the former judge at his Maine retreat as they built the case, and Fairbanks tentatively agreed to come in for a formal meeting with prosecutors. But when the day came, he never showed up. Sensing that Fairbanks might try to run, authorities moved quickly to finalize charges. On December 28, 1989, a Sullivan County grand jury indicted John C. Fairbanks on 4 counts of theft. The indictments detailed more than 100 instances in which Fairbanks had written checks, transferring money from his clients' accounts into his own. A warrant was immediately issued for the ex-judge's arrest. By the time police arrived to serve the warrant, John Fairbanks had already vanished. Within 24 hours of the indictment, he staged his disappearance. On December 29, 1989, Fairbanks's pickup truck was found abandoned near his Maine home, with no sign of him at the scene. The 66-year-old judge had seemingly disappeared into thin air overnight, alongside all of his ill-gotten gains. The sudden disappearance stunned both law enforcement and the community. Newport residents, already reeling from the revelations of Fairbanks's crimes, now had to absorb the shock that their former judge was officially a fugitive from justice. Fairbanks's flight from justice set off a massive investigation spanning multiple states and eventually multiple countries. New Hampshire authorities enlisted the help of federal agents as they chased leads on the missing judge. Early on, there were few solid clues. The case went cold for a time, a major setback for investigators who had worked for 2 years to build the fraud case only to have the suspect slip through their fingers. To generate new leads, law enforcement turned to the public and leveraged the audience of some of the most popular TV shows of the time. In 1991, Unsolved Mysteries featured the case, reenacting the judge's disappearance and asking viewers for tips. The following year, America's Most Wanted also spotlighted Fairbanks. These broadcasts yielded a flurry of calls and sightings, but none led to Fairbanks's capture. Privately, investigators suspected that Fairbanks had fled far beyond New England. With his knowledge of the legal system and access to untold amounts of wealth, he could have established a new identity with relative ease. One theory was that he might have crossed the nearby Canadian border soon after ditching his truck in Maine. However, if that was true, he managed to cover his tracks effectively. For years, every promising lead turned into another dead end. The search for the once respected judge became one of New Hampshire's most frustrating fugitive cases, and locals began to question if he would ever be brought to justice. But the disgraced judge couldn't run forever, and this question was finally answered in the spring of 1994. In late March of that year, Las Vegas police received a call from the sprawling MGM Grand Hotel regarding a guest who hadn't checked out. The guest had checked in under an assumed name a few days earlier and paid for 2 nights, but hadn't vacated the room or responded to staff. On the evening of March 27, 1994, hotel security entered the locked room and made a grim discovery. The man inside was dead, and a note was taped to the bathroom mirror. It didn't take long for authorities to confirm the man's identity. It was John Fairbanks, ending his 4-year run as a fugitive in a hotel room on the other side of the country. He was 70 years old. Fairbanks had checked into the MGM Grand on March 24th under the alias Richard Mansfield, a false identity he'd been using while on the run. The coroner ruled that he did it by himself, using asphyxiation, bringing the international manhunt to an abrupt end. With Fairbanks's death, investigators began to piece together how he had evaded capture for so long. It turned out Fairbanks had fled to Canada as suspected, and the details of his time on the lam were intriguing. For much of his time on the run, he had been living in Quebec City, in French-speaking Canada, under the Mansfield alias. Posing as a retired history professor from Ottawa, he rented luxury condominium apartments and blended into the community there. He paid cash for everything and lived quietly, avoiding any behavior that might attract attention. What finally drove Fairbanks to surface in Las Vegas remains a matter of speculation. In the days after his death, the New Hampshire Attorney General's office revealed a crucial detail. Fairbanks may have panicked after spotting someone familiar in the casino. Las Vegas was hosting a law enforcement conference that weekend, and among the attendees was one of the very investigators who had pursued Fairbanks's case back in New Hampshire. Authorities believed that Fairbanks, while walking through the bustling MGM Grand Casino, saw the investigator, a face he recognized, and thought the net was closing in. And it's important to remember here that the judge knew many of these investigators on a personal, even friendly level prior to becoming a fugitive. Rather than risk arrest and public humiliation, the judge retreated to his room and made his final decision. Interestingly, of course, the investigator wasn't there on account of the judge at all. It had all been a coincidence. Why the judge was visiting Vegas in the first place also remains an unsolved mystery. Many have questioned why a well-known fugitive who was living in hiding in Canada would have risked crossing the border at all. Even after Fairbanks himself was found, one enormous mystery remained unsolved. Where did all the money go? Investigators had traced roughly $1.8 million in thefts to the former judge and suspected the true total could be several times that. Despite this, virtually none of the missing money was ever recovered. For Fairbanks's many victims, this was a cruel final twist. Elderly clients who had expected a secure retirement had little hope of regaining their lost savings. But what was perhaps even more sick is that many of his clients were disabled people who had that money held in trust for their care and well-being. In essence, this trusted judge stole what comfort these severely disabled individuals could have expected in their lives in what I can only describe as a disturbed act of a twisted mind. Many have speculated he may have taken out margin loans against the stolen money to invest further in the stock market. When the market crashed in 1987, any of his clients' funds that he had gambled on the market would have lost significant value, and he may have been subject to a margin call. This is when borrowed investments lose value and the broker requires extra cash to meet their requirements. Otherwise, the stocks will be sold at a massive loss. To cover those losses, he may have stolen even more, in a spiral that eventually collapsed under its own weight. In the end, investigators leaned toward a simple if frustrating theory. Fairbanks spent most of the money, and what he didn't spend, he lost using the stock market as a personal casino. Others speculate that Fairbanks's knowledge of estate planning and trusts could have enabled him to siphon client funds into a labyrinth of offshore entities. By establishing shell companies in jurisdictions with strict banking secrecy laws, say, the Cayman Islands or Panama, he could have hidden assets beyond the reach of U.S. investigators. Setting up multi-layered corporate structures would have disguised the true owner of the accounts, making it exceedingly difficult for authorities to trace or repatriate any money. Given the era's limited cross-border cooperation, substantial sums might still lie undiscovered in such accounts. Still others believe that he had a significant gambling problem, which may explain why he risked the trip to Vegas despite being a wanted fugitive. Over many years, he may have been withdrawing from his clients' accounts to fund his gambling addiction, and then continued to withdraw more, believing he could cover these losses. When new money stopped flowing in due to the 1987 market crash, his entire scheme may have collapsed. Whatever the truth is, the whereabouts of the money stolen by Judge John Fairbanks will likely remain an unsolved mystery. In the early hours of May 4th, 2024, a quiet rural road in Lapeer County, Michigan, became the scene of a troubling mystery. A passing motorist on her way to work spotted a man lying in the southbound lane of Marathon Road, just west of Clam Road, in Oregon Township. Alarmed, she called 911, and sheriff's deputies arrived around 1:30 a.m. to find 26-year-old Morgan Carr unresponsive in the roadway. First responders attempted life-saving measures, but Morgan was pronounced dead at the scene. The location was only about a mile from his home, a dark stretch of road where one wouldn't expect to find a pedestrian at that hour. At first glance, authorities suspected a tragic hit-and-run accident, a driver who struck Morgan and fled, but the scene held puzzling clues that would soon cast doubt on that initial theory. To understand how Morgan Carr ended up on that lonely road, investigators retraced his final known movements on the night of May 3rd, 2024. Morgan had spent the evening with a friend at Amy's downtown Reservoir Bar and Grill in the nearby village of Columbiaville. That night at the bar was supposed to be a normal outing. Sometime before midnight, Morgan left the establishment on foot, reportedly intending to walk to his home in Oregon Township. He departed around 11:45 p.m., heading southward and taking La Valley Road toward Marathon Road, a route that would lead him several miles back home. Morgan's walk home was a considerable trek of approximately 5 miles, yet within roughly an hour and a half he had nearly covered that distance. A witness later reported seeing a tall male figure believed to be Morgan walking along Marathon Road around 12:30 a.m. in the area south of Mount Morris Road. Sometime after that sighting, however, something went terribly wrong. By 1:30 a.m., Morgan was found lying in the road near the Oregon Township Hall, fatally injured. Importantly, no vehicles were present at the scene when help arrived, and whoever or whatever caused his injuries was nowhere to be found. The autopsy results on Morgan Carr's body would transform the case from a presumed traffic accident into a baffling mystery. The Lapeer County Medical Examiner determined that Morgan died from blunt force trauma to a vital organ, specifically an injury to his liver. Strikingly, aside from this fatal internal injury, Morgan's body showed little outward damage. A detective noted that his injuries weren't consistent with a typical motor vehicle collision. His body was entirely intact, there were no broken bones and minimal obvious external injuries, and there was no blood at the scene. The absence of these indicators and the nature of the injury prompted authorities to rule the death suspicious rather than accidental. With the case now treated as a suspicious death, investigators embarked on a painstaking quest to piece together what happened during Morgan's final moments. Detectives interviewed those who saw Morgan that night and reviewed any available surveillance footage from the area. Using a combination of witness statements and video, police narrowed the window of his death. He was suspected to have died sometime between 12:30 a.m., when he was last likely seen alive, and around 1:30 a.m., when his body was discovered. One potential lead emerged in the form of a vehicle sighting. Around 1:14 a.m., a surveillance camera captured a pickup truck driving through the area near where Morgan was later found. Investigators have emphasized that they are keen to identify and speak with the driver of that pickup, viewing the individual as a possible witness or person of interest. As part of the investigation, authorities also looked into Morgan's activities prior to his walk. They learned that there had been a minor verbal disagreement at the bar that night, after which Morgan chose to leave on foot. However, there was no evidence of any physical altercation at the establishment. This detail provided context but few clues. The disagreement didn't appear to directly explain the fatal injury that occurred an hour or so later. Every aspect of Morgan's journey was scrutinized. The dark roads he walked, any passing cars, and anyone he might have encountered along the way. Yet, as weeks turned into months, the sheriff's department publicly acknowledged that the case remained unsolved and baffling. In the absence of an immediate explanation, several theories have circulated about what might have happened to Morgan Carr on that desolate road. I'm not going to run through the hit-and-run scenario again, but this does technically remain a possibility. However, the forensic evidence, or lack thereof, has largely discredited that scenario. Another theory, supported by Morgan's isolated injury, is that he could have been assaulted by an individual who delivered the acute rupture to his liver. A violent encounter with another person on the road, possibly someone he met after leaving the bar, could conceivably produce such an injury without obvious external wounds. Some have speculated whether Morgan might have accepted a short ride from someone or gotten into a vehicle, only to suffer an injury and be left on the roadside. That said, the lack of any external bruising still makes this highly unusual. No definitive evidence has emerged to confirm any specific chain of events, and authorities have not publicly named any suspects or potential persons responsible as of yet. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to like, subscribe, and hit the share button, and send this video to your friends. One of the world's most illustrious gemstones vanished without a trace in the aftermath of the tumultuous events of the early 20th century. The Florentine diamond, a magnificent yellow diamond once prized by European royalty, enjoyed centuries of prestige before its mysterious disappearance. Its saga spans opulent Renaissance courts and the fall of empires, culminating in a baffling mystery that has intrigued historians for over 100 years. In 1918, amid the chaos of a collapsing empire, this priceless gem simply vanished, and to this day, no one knows for certain what became of it. The Florentine diamond was an extraordinary stone by any measure. It weighed approximately 137 carats and was cut with 126 facets in an intricate double rose style, giving it a light yellow sparkle with a slight greenish tint. The early history of this jewel is deeply wrapped up in contradictory legends, but all versions of events end up with an extremely wealthy and powerful Italian family acquiring it. One story claims it belonged to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and that he carried it with him into battle. Unfortunately for Charles, he fell at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, and according to the legend, a peasant scavenged the gem and sold it for virtually nothing. From there, the diamond found its way into the hands of the Fugger banking family, after which they're speculated to have gifted the diamond to the Medici family. Another tale suggests that the diamond arrived in Europe much later. In this version of events, a Portuguese colonial governor obtained a large yellow diamond from a local ruler in the 16th century and later sold it to the Medici family of Florence. Whatever its true origin, by the mid-17th century, the Florentine diamond was confirmed to be in Tuscany under the Medici. In 1657, a French jeweler wrote about seeing the impressive gem among the possessions of Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici. According to this French artisan, the Grand Duke's father, Cosimo II, had the diamond expertly cut and polished. After the Medici line died out in 1737, the Florentine diamond passed to the new rulers of Florence and then into the House of Habsburg. Francis of Lorraine, who became Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, had married Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, linking the Tuscan treasure to the Austrian imperial family. The gem was brought to Vienna and became one of the highlights of the Habsburg crown jewels on display at the Hofburg Palace. A contemporary report in 1848 described the Florentine diamond as the most splendid of the imperial gems and valued it at £100,000 at the time, an astronomical sum. The final known chapter of the Florentine diamond's known history began with the fall of the Habsburg monarchy. In late 1918, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, Emperor Charles I fled into exile. The imperial family secretly took many crown jewels with them to Switzerland, including the famous Florentine diamond, hoping to keep these treasures safe. Then, at some point during this exile, the Florentine diamond vanished. The mysterious disappearance of the Florentine diamond has given rise to several theories about its fate. One prominent theory is that the exiled Habsburg family covertly sold the diamond to raise funds during their relatively impoverished years abroad. And relative poverty really is the key term here, since they still lived in extreme opulence even during these times. But considering the Habsburg Emperor Charles V was the person who was first described as possessing an empire on which the sun never sets, it was quite the reduction in wealth. Given the stone's notoriety, proponents of this idea suggest it may have been cut into smaller gems first, so that the pieces could be sold discreetly without drawing attention. An alternative theory blames theft. Perhaps an opportunistic servant or associate stole the Florentine during the chaos of exile and fled with it overseas. Rumors indeed emerged that a supposedly loyal servant of the Habsburgs absconded with the giant yellow diamond and eventually sold it in South America. Some have even speculated that the jewel might have been lost in transit or used as a bribe during the family's escape, but such claims remain unverified. Notably, while the Habsburgs were in exile, both the Austrian and Italian governments claimed that they were the rightful owners of the diamond. The Austrian government claimed that the contents of the royal treasury were that of the Austrian state, and that the Habsburgs didn't have the right to take it. The Italians, for their part, argued that it should be returned to them on the basis that the Medicis once owned it. This Italian claim is a little bit unusual, given that the diamond was inherited by the Habsburgs after generations of intermarriage with the Medici family. However, all that is to say that the Habsburgs, at the low point of their power and influence, had two states which claimed their diamond. As such, and given that they weren't in the best financial state, it seems most likely that they either sold it or used it as collateral for a very large loan. That said, the idea that they entrusted one of their longtime servants with this task, and the servant simply ran off with it, is also possible. Over a century has now passed since the Florentine diamond was last seen, and its fate remains an unsolved mystery. Today, a replica of the diamond is available for viewing in the Palazzo Medici Museum in Florence. Jasmine Moody was a 19-year-old college student from Texas who vanished while visiting a friend in Detroit in December 2014. Moody was a freshman at Texas Woman's University and had flown to Detroit over Thanksgiving break to spend time with 22-year-old Brittany Gurley. This was a young woman she met online months prior. The exact nature of their relationship was somewhat unclear. Moody's family believed Brittany was just a friend, while police very strongly believed that the two were romantically linked. What is certain is that on the evening of December 4th, 2014, something went terribly wrong, and Jasmine Moody was never seen again. Jasmine arrived in Detroit on November 25, 2014, planning to stay with Brittany Gurley at Gurley's family home on Detroit's east side until early December. She was due to catch a bus back to Texas on December 5th, the day after her disappearance. On December 4th, Jasmine and Brittany reportedly got into an argument, allegedly sparked by something involving social media posts. According to Brittany's account to police, the disagreement escalated, and Brittany briefly walked out of the room to cool off. When she returned around 7:30 p.m., Jasmine was gone. Brittany claimed that Jasmine had left the house on foot, stepping out into the cold Detroit night, wearing only a university hoodie, jeans, and boots. She had left behind nearly all her belongings. Her purse, ID, money, credit cards, cell phone, and even her coat were still inside the house. It was a frigid December evening just above freezing, and Jasmine wasn't dressed for the weather outside. Brittany Gurley and her family searched the neighborhood for about 15 minutes that night, and finding no trace of Jasmine, called Detroit police to report her missing. Jasmine's family in Texas was alerted and immediately became concerned. It was completely out of character for her to lose contact or go missing without explanation. Detroit police opened a missing person case and began an investigation. Early on, they treated the situation with urgency. Officers canvassed the area and brought in the Michigan State Police Crime Lab to examine the Gurley home for any evidence of foul play, but everything came up clean. Sniffer dogs were also deployed in and around the neighborhood in hopes of picking up Jasmine's scent or discovering any clues, but these searches yielded nothing definitive. Despite countless interviews and searches, investigators didn't uncover any solid leads in the immediate aftermath of Jasmine's disappearance. In the days and weeks following December 4th, Jasmine's family traveled to Detroit to assist in the search. They distributed flyers and pleaded with the public for any information, but no new clues turned up. With no definitive evidence, investigators and Jasmine's family have been forced to consider several theories about what happened on the night of December 4th, 2014. The two leading scenarios hinge on whether Jasmine actually left the house of her own accord or not. From early on, Jasmine's loved ones have harbored suspicions about the account given by Brittany Gurley, the last person to see her. They find it hard to believe that Jasmine would voluntarily walk away into a dangerous night without any of her belongings, never to contact anyone again. Some have alleged that the argument between Jasmine and Brittany may have escalated to violence or an accident, and that Jasmine never truly left the house alive. In this theory, someone at the residence could have harmed Jasmine, intentionally or not, and then concealed what happened, fabricating the story of her walking off to deflect blame. Those who side with this theory point to several supporting details such as Jasmine's phone, ID, and money being left behind. To date, authorities have not named Brittany or anyone else as a suspect in Jasmine's disappearance, citing insufficient evidence of any crime whatsoever. Brittany and her family maintain that they have no idea what happened to Jasmine after she left that night, and they've expressed frustration at being treated like criminals by some parties. I think it's extremely important to remember here that they reported her missing literally immediately. They also willingly let investigators fully examine their home with a fine-tooth comb without a warrant. The other major theory is that Jasmine did indeed walk out of the house after the argument. The fact that she was in an unfamiliar part of Detroit after dark, alone and without a phone or money, raises the possibility that she fell victim to a crime of opportunity. Jasmine was a young woman walking in a rough neighborhood at night. It's conceivable that she could have been abducted, assaulted, or otherwise harmed by someone. Detroit's East Side had and has an extremely high crime rate, and Jasmine would have had no easy way to call for help or navigate the area in the cold. Unfortunately, if a stranger did target Jasmine, there have been no known eyewitnesses or surveillance footage to identify what happened. Another theory which has been discussed far less is that Jasmine may have had a mental breakdown. Perhaps the reality of her relationship going poorly, or not to plan, had serious mental health consequences. Notably, she was at the age where mental health issues can come out. Jasmine's family continues to keep her memory alive and hold out hope for answers. They've accepted the likelihood that Jasmine may no longer be alive, but they desperately seek to know how and why she disappeared, so that they can have closure. I suspect the best chance of this case being resolved is if a Jane Doe is tied to her family through genetic genealogy. "16-year-old Amber Cates from Columbia, Tennessee, planned to spend her spring break visiting relatives in Florida. On April 11, 2004, Amber was dropped off at her mother's house, expecting to leave for the trip that day. Instead, a friend arrived to pick her up, and Amber rode away with him, never to be seen again. By all accounts, Amber was a bright and spirited teenager, but Amber had also begun to test boundaries. She was hanging out with older, questionable friends and is believed to have occasionally indulged in illicit substances. When she vanished that spring day, what initially seemed like a potential runaway case soon turned into something far more troubling. Now, more than 20 years later, Amber's disappearance remains an unsolved mystery that haunts her community and family. In early April 2004, Amber was living with her older half-sister Brenda, who had just become Amber's legal guardian a few days earlier. Brenda was trying to provide stability for Amber after a difficult few years. Their father had died around 1999, and Amber had spent time in foster care and lived in multiple states before returning to Tennessee. That spring, Amber made plans to visit a relative in Panama City, Florida, for a short vacation during spring break. On April 11th, 2004, which was Easter Sunday, Brenda dropped Amber off at their mother Trudy's home in Columbia so Amber could depart from there for her trip. However, Amber never actually left town with any relative. Instead, a 20-year-old man named James Gordon arrived that day to pick her up. Gordon was described as Amber's friend, and possibly her boyfriend at the time. Amber climbed into the car with him, telling family she would be back in 2 days, and the pair drove off. She didn't pack as if she were running away for good. It appeared to be just a quick spring break outing. That was the last time Amber's family ever saw her. When 2 days passed and Amber failed to return or call, her family grew worried. They soon discovered that Amber had never arrived in Florida at all. On April 13th or 14th, 2004, Amber's family filed a missing persons report with local authorities. At first, police considered the possibility that Amber had run away on her own, and based on Amber's history, they assumed she was a runaway. But Amber's family insisted she wouldn't just disappear without contacting anyone. Indeed, as days went by with no word from Amber, signs began to point to something more sinister than a teenage runaway case. Her cell phone showed no activity and her bank account showed no withdrawals, two facts which strongly indicated that she hadn't planned any sort of disappearance. The timeline of Amber's last known movements would soon raise even more red flags. According to what James Gordon told police, he and Amber spent some time together in Columbia on the day she disappeared. Gordon claimed that after he picked Amber up, he later dropped her off with another friend of his that evening. This other friend was 39-year-old Ronald Inzuriaga. It's unclear how well Amber herself knew Inzuriaga. He was a much older man with an extremely serious and violent criminal background. He had been convicted of SA in 1992 and spent several years in prison. What is known is that Amber somehow ended up in Inzuriaga's company after leaving with Gordon. Police immediately tried to locate this man, but ran into dead ends, and ultimately, it took 3 years to track him down. The story Ronald later gave would be the last known trace of Amber. He said that he and Amber went to lunch at a Waffle House on James Campbell Boulevard in Columbia. They then stopped so Amber could buy some hair dye, and finally he dropped her off at a garage that was a local hangout spot for teens. It was at that garage, Inzuriaga claimed, that Amber completely disappeared. Curiously, no witnesses have ever definitively confirmed seeing her at the garage, despite that location being the last place she was reported to be. Over the years, several theories have been proposed by law enforcement, by Amber's family, and by community members to explain what might have happened on that April day in 2004. The earliest credible theory was the idea that she was a runaway. However, given that she never contacted friends and family further at any point in the last 2 decades, and given that her social security number was never used, this is considered unlikely. Another theory that has been discussed is that Amber could have fallen victim to trafficking or some form of exploitation. This idea arose mainly because of Amber's age and the circumstances. She was a 16-year-old girl out with older men, one of whom had an extremely disturbing past. While this theory remains plausible, there's nothing beyond the initial circumstantial evidence to support it. Crucially, despite over 2 decades having passed, there have been no sightings of her whatsoever. By and large, the most credible theory in Amber Cates's disappearance is that she met with foul play at the hands of the individuals she was last seen with. The suspicious sequence of events on April 11th, 2004 raises many questions, and just allow me to very briefly sum up how shady this is. One adult man picks up a troubled 16-year-old girl, then hands her off to another even older adult man, who happens to be on a very bad registry, later that same day. The second man, the dude on the registry hanging around with the troubled 16-year-old girl, claims he simply dropped said girl off, and claims no knowledge beyond that. Oh yeah, and also no one saw her at the popular hangout where she was supposedly dropped off. Literally everything about that detour in Colombia seems suspect. It's also necessary to ask, why was a 16-year-old girl, quote-unquote, friends with a 39-year-old like this guy in the first place? Further, it's been questioned to what extent the two of them even knew each other, with the source that they were friends being James Gordon, another questionable individual. Ronald's background makes it hard not to consider him a prime suspect in whatever befell Amber. To be clear, neither man has ever been charged in connection with the case, and both have denied wrongdoing. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to click the like button and also share this video with your friends and family. Now let's get back to business. On the night of September 11th, 2005, traffic at a busy intersection in Stanton, California, was disrupted by a sudden tragedy. A young woman dashed across the street against a red light and was struck by a car at around 9 p.m. near the corner of Beach Boulevard and Orangewood Avenue. The impact was severe, and paramedics rushed the gravely injured pedestrian to West Anaheim Medical Center, where despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly afterward. She carried no identification, and in the aftermath of the accident, this woman remained entirely unknown. Authorities would come to refer to her only as the Stanton Jane Doe, the nameless victim of a fatal accident who left behind many clues but no clear identity. Investigators at the scene noted that the young woman appeared to be in her late teens or 20s. Her face was intact and recognizable despite the trauma, giving hope that someone might identify her. Yet no witnesses or personal documents could tell responders who she was. As police began their work, the immediate priority, beyond tending to the accident, became unraveling the mystery of this Jane Doe's identity. Who was this woman, and why had no one come forward to claim her? The official investigation kicked off that very night in 2005, setting in motion a case that remains unsolved to this day. From the outset, detectives gathered every available clue from the young woman's person and the accident scene. Forensic examiners documented her physical characteristics in detail. She was around 5 feet 3 inches tall and 165 pounds, with long wavy black or brown hair and brown eyes. Perhaps the most telling clues were the clothing and personal belongings found with the Stanton Jane Doe. She was fully dressed in casual attire, suggesting she had been out and about that day. Notably, she wore a black tank top emblazoned with the words, "Baby Girl," in sequins, along with a white striped shirt over it. Over her outfit, she carried a distinctive jacket bearing the word New York on the front and NY Black Yankees on one sleeve. On her wrists, she wore several silver bangle bracelets. All of these items were carefully collected by the coroner. Inside the small black purse she had been carrying, investigators found more intriguing evidence. Tucked in her purse was a one-day bus pass for Orange County Bus Route 38, dated September 11th, 2005, the very day of the accident. The bus pass appeared to have been purchased in the city of Norwalk, in Los Angeles County. There were also several shopping receipts from stores at the Buena Park Mall, a nearby shopping center, all time-stamped on the afternoon of September 11th, 2005. In fact, records show she made purchases that day. One receipt from a shoe store around 5:30 for $70, and another from a clothing store around 6 p.m. for a jacket. Finally, in her purse was a damaged CD containing a compilation of reggaeton songs from 2005. Investigators noted that this is a musical genre with roots in Puerto Rico and Latin America, possibly another hint toward her cultural background. Each of these belongings, the bus ticket, the receipts, the CD, painted a partial picture of the Jane Doe's final day. She had likely spent the afternoon shopping and then taken a bus that evening, ending up on foot in Stanton. But none of these clues, as useful as they were for tracing her steps, immediately answered the core question: her name. Forensic evidence was also collected in hopes of a future identification. The coroner took the woman's fingerprints and DNA samples and preserved her dental records. Her fingerprints were run through law enforcement databases, but yielded no match to any known missing person or criminal record. DNA was uploaded to national unidentified persons databases, likewise with no immediate result. A dental examination suggested she was in her early 20s, with one forensic dentist estimating an age range of roughly 21 to 26 years based on her teeth. All this data was entered into official databases like NameUs in the hope that eventually a match would emerge. Despite these efforts, in the initial investigation in 2005, no leads to her identity surfaced. It seemed she had not been reported missing at the time, and nothing about her fingerprints or DNA had a prior record on file. The case grew cold, and the Stanton Jane Doe was laid to rest in a county cemetery, her headstone lacking her name. Although the trail was initially cold, authorities did not close the book on the Stanton Jane Doe. Over the years, the Orange County Sheriff's Department and Coroner's Office periodically revisited the case, hoping new techniques or information might provide a breakthrough. They compared her profile against countless missing persons reports from California and across the country. By 2013, 8 years after the accident, investigators had formally ruled out almost 150 different missing women as being this Jane Doe. In October of the same year, as the 8th anniversary of the incident passed, Orange County officials made a renewed public push to identify the unknown woman. They released a forensic sketch of her face to the media, hoping it might jog someone's memory. The sketch depicted a youthful woman with curly hair and a gentle expression based on morgue photographs and the coroner's observations. In parallel with the official investigation, the Stanton Jane Doe case has drawn the attention of amateur sleuths and true crime followers on the internet. Over the years, various public theories and speculation have emerged as people try to piece together who this young woman might have been. One popular line of reasoning is that the woman may have been a visitor from out of the area, possibly from the East Coast or Caribbean. Enthusiasts point to the NY Black Yankees jacket and the reggaeton music CD as cultural clues. Some have speculated that she could have been of either Puerto Rican or Dominican descent. This is based on the combination of her physical appearance, New York-branded clothing, and Latin music. If she was from out of town, some have speculated that she may have been staying in a local hotel. If this theory were true, perhaps no family reported her missing, because her relatives were in another state or even country, completely unaware of the tragedy. Additionally, some have noted that jaywalking across a wide California boulevard, as she did, might be something a person from out of state would misjudge. People familiar with both Los Angeles and NYC have speculated that a local Angelino likely would have known not to jaywalk at the time and place she did. And, full disclosure here, I ended up going down a bit of a rabbit hole on the jaywalking culture in both cities. In NYC, where I've been and personally jaywalked on numerous occasions, I've seen people pull stunts in traffic which I considered extremely risky, like it was absolutely nothing to them. For any fans of Seinfeld out there, I'm reminded of the scene where George tries to jaywalk a Frogger machine across the street, with disastrous results. I'm much less personally familiar with LA, But according to my research, fast vehicles and very wide streets make it genuinely dangerous to jaywalk. Further, the LAPD had historically been very harsh in imposing stiff financial penalties associated with jaywalking, unlike in NYC where the cops are very lax about it. Others have speculated that she was a local or recent transplant to the area who may have been estranged from her family. Some have speculated that given the limited amount of belongings carried on her, that this speaks to her being a local resident. Personally, I think this could just as easily support the theory that she left her ID in her hotel or motel while she went out. Others have speculated that she wasn't reported missing because she was living a transient lifestyle. This theory doesn't suggest she was living on the streets, but rather that she may have been bouncing around between homes of friends and acquaintances. As such, her disappearance may not have been noted in any meaningful way, and whoever she was staying with may have just thought she had moved on. Ultimately, at this point, I think this is a case that most likely gets resolved through genetic genealogy. It's unclear to me if the authorities have submitted her DNA to Othram or a similar company for testing, though I suspect they haven't. And the reason I say they likely haven't is that genetic genealogy is new, expensive, and time-consuming. There's no unsolved crime or potential perpetrator associated with solving her case, so I suspect that given limited investigative resources, we won't see a resolution for a few years. Something strange has been happening to tourists who visit Jerusalem. Jerusalem, for those unaware, is considered one of the holiest cities by all of the Abrahamic faiths. A British tourist named Oliver McAfee vanished in the Israeli desert in 2017, leaving behind pages torn from a Bible that referenced Jesus' 40 days of wilderness fasting. Investigators suspect that McAfee, a devout cyclist on a pilgrimage, may have been driven by a rare psychiatric phenomenon known as Jerusalem syndrome. Decades earlier in 1969, Australian visitor Dennis Rowan set fires at important religious and cultural buildings, believing he was on a divine mission. Other bizarre incidents include acting out specific biblical scenes in the city, or coming to believe that your entire life parallels that of an important religious figure. Though separated by time and circumstance, these bizarre incidents share a common thread. Each stems from an overwhelming religious delusion triggered by the mystical aura of Jerusalem. Jerusalem syndrome refers to a rare psychological phenomenon in which tourists or pilgrims experience acute, religiously themed psychosis during a visit to Jerusalem. The afflicted are seized by powerful delusions, often believing they are prophets or holy figures on a mission. Strikingly, this syndrome has been observed in people of various faiths, and sometimes, but more rarely, even people of no faith whatsoever. Psychiatrists note that a typical episode involves intense religious obsession or hallucinations that resolve after a short time, especially once the person is removed from the region. In other words, someone seemingly mentally healthy can arrive in Jerusalem and suddenly become psychotic with a sacred mission, then return to normal within weeks of leaving. This dramatic transient madness sets Jerusalem syndrome apart from more ordinary travel anxiety and from other city-specific syndromes. Notably, Jerusalem syndrome is not recognized as an official disorder in medical manuals. It doesn't appear in the DSM-5 or the ICD-10, reflecting ongoing debate over whether it truly stands alone as a diagnosis. Instead, it straddles the boundary between cultural phenomenon and psychiatric mystery, challenging doctors to explain why the holy city can push a few minds over the edge. Ever since psychiatrists began documenting Jerusalem syndrome, experts have proposed different theories to explain it. In a landmark 2000 study, the syndrome was classified into 3 types: Type 1 referred to people with a pre-existing psychotic illness who traveled to Jerusalem driven by their delusions. For example, there was an American man with schizophrenia who believed he was the biblical Samson and felt compelled to move a stone block at the Western Wall. Type 2 included visitors with eccentric or obsessive religious ideas, though not outright psychosis, whose intense fixations were sparked into a breakdown by the city. One such case was an otherwise healthy German pilgrim obsessed with finding the one true version of Christianity. He suffered a psychotic episode inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is said to be on the site where Jesus is said to have been crucified. Finally, Type 3 was the classic Jerusalem syndrome. A completely sane person with no prior psychiatric history who becomes psychotic upon arriving in Jerusalem. These people experience a brief and fleeting attack, and then recover spontaneously after leaving. Despite decades of study, Jerusalem syndrome remains an enigma in the fields of psychology and medicine. No one can yet fully explain why Jerusalem, in particular, has the power to unravel certain minds in such a unique way. After all, there are holy sites and pilgrimage sites all over the world, but in general, people are able to hold it together. What is clear is that the condition is exceedingly rare and seemingly requires a perfect storm of factors that Jerusalem conjures up. For those who have experienced it, Jerusalem syndrome can be life-altering, if only briefly. Many return home embarrassed or puzzled by their own actions once the spell has passed. Glenn and Bessie Hyde were an adventurous young couple whose honeymoon adventure in the Grand Canyon became the stuff of legends. Their journey was meant to put their names in the record books, but instead, it became a mystery with more twists and turns than the Colorado River itself. Glenn was born in Idaho in 1898 and grew up working on his family's farm. An experienced outdoorsman, he had previously built his own boats and navigated wild rivers, and in 1926 he ran the Salmon and Snake Rivers in Idaho. Bessie, born in West Virginia in 1905, had an artistic bohemian streak. She was a poet and had even tried her hand at theater and art. The two met as passengers on a ship traveling to Los Angeles in 1927 and felt an instant connection. At the time, Bessie was unhappily married to another man, but she obtained a quick divorce the following year. Just one day after her divorce was finalized, Bessie married Glenn on April 10th, 1928. For their honeymoon, Glenn proposed an ambitious journey. He would build a custom boat, and together, they would run the rapids of the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. If successful, Bessie would become the first woman ever documented to navigate the Grand Canyon in this way. But this intrepid duo wasn't planning on breaking just one barrier. They were planning on setting the record for the fastest navigation of the Grand Canyon by boat. Beyond the thrill of exploration, the couple saw this journey as a path to fame and fortune. They planned to write a book about their adventure and go on a lecture tour recounting their exploits. In the late 1920s, such daring exploits captured the public's imagination. Charles Lindbergh had recently flown across the Atlantic, and adventurers were celebrated as heroes. Glenn and Bessie hoped their river voyage would catapult them into that pantheon of explorers, and at ages 29 and 22 respectively, the newlyweds eagerly set out to make their mark. On October 20th, 1928, 6 months after their wedding, Glenn and Bessie launched their honeymoon adventure. In the town of Green River, Utah, Glenn had constructed a sturdy 20-foot wooden flat-bottom boat suitable for heavy rapids. Local rivermen remarked that the homemade craft looked ominously like a coffin, and warned that few amateurs attempted the Colorado's rapids in such boats. Undeterred, the Hydes pushed off down the Green River, which feeds into the Colorado, aiming to reach Needles, California by early December. Only about 50 people had ever navigated the entire Grand Canyon by boat at that time, underscoring the audacity of their attempt. The first weeks of the voyage went relatively smoothly, especially given the difficulty of the voyage and the fact that Bessie was inexperienced in rapid river conditions. Glenn's river running experience and careful preparation paid off as they traversed Utah's Labyrinth and Cataract Canyons and entered Arizona. But the Colorado River in Grand Canyon was more formidable than anything Glenn had seen. In letters to his family, he described the rapids as longer and fiercer than those he'd encountered elsewhere. The journey was not without scares. At one point, Glenn was tossed out of the boat, and Bessie had to pull him back in, and another rapid nearly swept Bessie overboard. Still, by mid-November, the couple had traveled over 200 miles and reached Bright Angel Creek in Grand Canyon, achieving a remarkably fast run for the era. That said, they no longer had any meaningful chance of breaking any speedrunning records, which changed their plans slightly. On November 15th, 1928, with the most dangerous stretch of river still ahead, Glenn and Bessie decided to pause their river trek. They hiked up the Bright Angel Trail to Grand Canyon Village on the south rim to resupply and rest. During this brief layover, the Hydes drew attention. They were interviewed by a reporter from the Denver Post, and their bold trip was noted by tourists and locals at the canyon rim. The famed Grand Canyon photographer Emery Kolb welcomed them into his studio at the rim. Kolb had twice run the river himself and knew its perils well. He took a now famous photograph of the couple standing at the canyon's edge on November 17th, 1928. Observing them, Kolb noted that Bessie appeared worn out and apprehensive about continuing the journey. He also observed that Glenn was extremely exhausted, but determined, perhaps to the detriment of the couple. Emery Kolb urged the newlyweds to postpone the rest of the trip until spring, and even offered them additional safety gear, such as life jackets and inner tubes. Glenn refused all assistance, insisting he and Bessie were strong swimmers and determined to finish the trip without such help. According to Kolb, Glenn declared, quote, "I'm going to do it without life jackets or else," a defiant statement that in hindsight sounds foreboding. It appears that they didn't take these basic safety precautions under the belief that it would make their story more sensationalistic after they had completed the trip. On November 16th, they met a wealthy adventurer, Gilbert Sutro, at Phantom Ranch and agreed to give him a short ride downriver. Sutro rode with Glenn and Bessie for a couple of days, and on November 18th, 1928, they dropped him off at a location called Hermit Camp. Gilbert Sutro would be the last person to ever see Glenn and Bessie, and the Hydes continued downstream into the canyon's isolation. Glenn and Bessie never arrived at their destination. They had expected to finish their voyage and meet family in Needles, California by early December. When the scheduled date passed with no word from the Hydes, concern rapidly grew. Alarmed by the overdue newlyweds, Glenn's father, a man named Rollin Hyde, launched a vigorous search effort almost immediately. In December 1928, Rollin traveled to Grand Canyon and organized multiple search parties. Experienced river runners, including Emery Kolb, the photographer from earlier, and his brother Ellsworth, joined the effort. Rollin also enlisted experienced Native American trackers to scour the canyon rims for any sign of the couple. Such was the concern that the U.S. Secretary of War was convinced to authorize an aerial search of the Grand Canyon, a dramatic measure in those days. On December 19th, 1928, an Army aircraft scouting the canyon finally spotted something: the Hydes boat, adrift in the icy Colorado River. It was floating upright in a calm stretch of water near River Mile 237, not far from the end of the Grand Canyon at the Lower Granite Gorge. A few days later, on December 24th, Emery Kolb reached the abandoned boat and inspected it. Mysteriously, the vessel was in good shape. It hadn't been smashed up as one may expect in a fatal rapids accident. The boat was upright and undamaged, merely holding about a foot of water inside. Even more puzzling, all of the couple's supplies were still neatly stowed. Glenn and Bessie's personal belongings remained strapped in place. Their food provisions, cooking gear, and blankets, even their coats and hiking boots were still in the boat. Amongst the other significant items found aboard were Bessie's diary and the camera containing photographs of their trip. Nothing appeared amiss, except for the fact that Glenn and Bessie were nowhere to be found. Searchers combed the area for clues. They discovered footprints and a campsite believed to be the Hyde's last camp, around River Mile 225 or 226 near Diamond Creek. The diary recovered from the boat provided a tantalizing glimpse into the final days of the journey. Bessie's last entry was dated November 30th, 1928, nearly 2 weeks after the Hydes were last seen by Sutro. In that entry, Bessie noted that they had successfully cleared the rapid at the 231-mile mark and were likely ahead of schedule, having regained lost time. The fact that they had regained this time may have meant the couple was taking further unnecessary risks in an effort to make the story more media-worthy. This suggested they had survived many days beyond November 18th and navigated some of the canyon's hardest rapids. By all evidence, the Hydes had been making good progress and were within about 40 miles of their goal in early December. One possible clue came from a canyon prospector who reported seeing a brown leather jacket floating in the river around the time of the Hydes' disappearance. Bessie was known to wear a brown leather jacket, raising the grim possibility that she had been tossed into the water. That said, the jacket was never recovered, and that clue ended up amounting to nothing. Despite exhaustive searches by land, air, and water, no bodies or definitive traces of Glenn or Bessie were ever found. The official investigation eventually concluded without a clear resolution. No remains meant no way to say for certain what happened. Investigators presumed the couple had met with a tragic accident in the canyon. In the absence of other evidence, authorities believed that at some point in early December, the Hyde's boat struck hidden rocks in a rapid near mile 232. It's believed that this forceful strike ejected both Glenn and Bessie into the cold, swift river. Given that neither had worn life jackets, the strong currents could have quickly swept them under. On paper, the Hydes were declared dead by drowning, but the lack of concrete proof left the case frustratingly open-ended. The disappearance of Glenn and Bessie Hyde made headlines and captivated the public in 1928 and 1929. Here was a daring young couple who ventured into the wild for their honeymoon and simply vanished. Newspapers recounted their adventurous spirits and the enigma of their empty boat. At a time when Grand Canyon expeditions were front-page news, the Hyde's fate became one of the great unsolved mysteries of the American West. The story's elements, romance, adventure, and an unexplained vanishing, would continue to spark curiosity and conjecture for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath of the failed expedition, most people accepted the simple explanation that Glenn and Bessie Hyde had suffered a fatal mishap on the river. Park authorities noted the treacherous nature of the rapids at mile 232, which had a history of wrecking boats and was considered the likeliest point of disaster. However, the very mystery that made the Hyde story famous also invited speculation. With no bodies recovered and some puzzling aspects, like the boat being undamaged, alternative theories began to circulate in the years following 1928. Even early on, those close to the case pondered different scenarios. Emery Kolb, who had been among the last to speak with the couple, theorized that perhaps disaster struck while they were scouting a rapid on foot. River runners often walk along the shore to examine dangerous rapids before running them. Kolb speculated that one of the hides might have slipped into the water and the other jumped in to attempt a rescue, leading both to be swept away. Glenn's father, Rollin, had a different idea. He wondered if the couple might have encountered trouble with a rapid, decided to abandon the river, and tried to hike out of the canyon on foot. In Rollin's scenario, Glenn and Bessie could have gotten lost in the wilderness and died of exhaustion and exposure in a remote area. However, search teams never found footprints or tracks leading away from the river, which some believe makes this unlikely. Rumors also took hold, and with Emery Kolb playing such a prominent role in finding the boat, some whispers cast suspicion on him. These unfounded suspicions gained little traction until many years later, when a grisly discovery on Kolb's property would revive such talk. But I'll come back to that in a moment. Others looked to the hides themselves for answers. One dark theory suggested that perhaps Glenn, described by friends as determined and occasionally stubborn, might have lost his temper and harmed Bessie during an argument. Conversely, some speculated Bessie might have grown desperate to escape the perilous journey and slain Glenn. Both of these ideas led down the rabbit hole of theories that either one of them may have escaped and lived out the rest of their life under a new identity. Decades passed, yet the story of the hides refused to fade away. In 1971, 43 years after the disappearance, a startling claim made headlines and briefly suggested a very different ending to the tale. That year, an elderly woman named Elizabeth Cutler joined a commercial rafting trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. As the group swapped stories around a campfire near Diamond Creek, the quiet older woman calmly announced to her fellow rafters, "I'm Bessie Hyde." She told a brutal story of how she allegedly had to slay her husband in self-defense. After capturing headlines and attention, the authorities investigated her, and she was determined to have fabricated the entire thing. She was a retired psychology professor who, and I'm not joking here, said she made the false claim as a social experiment. Yeah, you heard me correctly. Elizabeth Cutler dropped, "It's just a prank, bro," as her defense in 1971. Truly, she was decades ahead of her time. But then things got even weirder. And trust me, this won't be the last time I drop that line. Another twist came to light in 1992 with the death of legendary river guide Georgie Clark. Georgie was a pioneering woman in the Grand Canyon rafting community, famous for her own river exploits. After she passed away, friends sorting through her belongings found some curious items, including the marriage certificate of Glenn and Bessie Hyde. Further, they found a birth certificate for a woman named Bessie DeRoss. These discoveries led to rampant speculation that Georgie Clark had actually been Bessie Hyde living under a new name. The coincidence of the name Bessie, the possession of the Hyde's documents, and Georgie's secretive nature fueled this theory in the public imagination. However, historians quickly noted that Georgie Clark's early life was well documented and did not match Bessie's biography. No credible evidence ever tied Georgie to the Hyde case beyond those curious artifacts, but some people still theorize the two may have been one and the same. But then things got even weirder, yet again. Meanwhile, a more concrete discovery had been made years earlier that cast suspicion back on Emery Kolb. In 1976, Emery Kolb died at the age of 95, having lived at the Grand Canyon for decades after the Hydes vanished. In 1977, as Kolb's historic studio was being sorted and cleaned, workers made a gruesome find in a boathouse on the property, a skeleton stuffed inside an old wooden box. The remains appeared to be that of a young adult male. The unknown skeleton's height and build roughly matched Glenn Hyde, and chillingly, a bullet was found lodged in the skull. This discovery spurred sensational rumors that Kolb, one of the last to see the hides alive, might have slain Glenn and hidden his body for nearly 50 years. Some theorized that Emery had slain Glenn after having become infatuated with Bessie. What happened to Bessie in this version of events varied, but in the end, it wouldn't matter due to a forensic break in 2008. Finally, in 2008, modern forensic efforts solved the riddle of the skeleton and cleared Emery Kolb's name. The skeleton was eventually linked to an individual who voluntarily departed the world in 1933. But it begged the question why a photographer and river runner was keeping human remains. A dig through the historical archives eventually produced what many view as a satisfactory answer. Emery Kolb had served a variety of official roles in the region, and around 1933 he had served as a representative of the local coroner. It's suspected that Emery collected the skeleton and then improperly stored it. Nearly a century has passed since Glenn and Bessie Hyde set off down the Colorado River, chasing adventure and a place in the record books. What was meant to be the journey of a lifetime instead became a dark, unsolved chapter in wilderness lore. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy just shouting out my two other channels, Lazy Chill History and Lazy Chill True Crime. The first focuses on historical content and mysteries, while the second focuses on solved true crime cases. In October 2000, near the shores of Utah's Great Salt Lake, a pair of duck hunters stumbled upon a gruesome discovery: human remains in a marshy field. Scattered among the bones were a few personal items, including a white sock, a scrap of t-shirt, and a blue woven choker necklace, along with strands of long blonde hair. There was no identification, no clue to the victim's name. Investigators dubbed the unknown young woman Saltaire Sally after the nearby Saltaire concert venue and set out to learn who she was and what had happened to her. Detectives scoured missing person reports and commissioned a forensic artist to reconstruct Saltaire Sally's face from her skull. The reconstructed likeness and details of her jewelry were circulated to the public, but no one recognized her. By early 2001, the case had gone cold, and the young woman's identity and the story behind her death remained a mystery. At the same time, Nicole Bacoles, who went by Nikki, a 20-year-old mother from Renton, Washington, had gone missing. In 1998, she moved to Utah with her boyfriend Joel Chowden and soon gave birth to a baby girl named Chloe. Life in Utah proved difficult, and the young couple struggled, and not long after Chloe's birth, they lost custody of their baby. Joel later told police that after an argument one night in March 2000, he left to cool off, and when he returned, Nikki had vanished, never to be seen again. Back in Washington state, Nikki's family grew increasingly worried as they hadn't heard from her in ages. However, they didn't file a missing persons report, as they had believed she had simply not wanted any contact with her family. Finally, in 2003, 3 years after Nikki's disappearance, her family filed an official missing person report. By then, Nikki's body had already been found in Utah, only no one knew it was hers. The missing person case and the Jane Doe case had yet to connect, and that connection came through an unexpected scientific breakthrough. In 2008, cold case investigators in Utah tried a new forensic technique to identify Saltaire Sally. They analyzed a strand of the victim's hair for chemical traces that could indicate where she had lived. The results pointed to the Pacific Northwest region of the United States, and this was a crucial clue. Detectives refocused on missing persons from that part of the country and soon came across Nikki's name, noting her age and description lined up with the unknown victim. In 2011, police obtained a DNA sample from Nikki's mother. By August 2012, the mystery was solved. DNA testing confirmed that Saltaire Sally was indeed Nicole Bacoles. After 12 years of not knowing, the young woman found by the Great Salt Lake finally had her name back. For Nikki's family, the news was a mix of heartbreak and relief. It ended years of uncertainty. They now knew what happened to Nikki, but it also confirmed she had been slain. With Nikki's identity established, detectives refocused on tracking down who was responsible for her death. The Salt Lake County Sheriff vowed that the case would not be dropped, insisting they would find whoever took Nikki's life and bring them to justice. Determining exactly how Nikki died was difficult, as her remains were too decomposed to reveal a clear cause, but investigators were certain it was foul play. The remote spot where she was left and the lack of personal belongings at the scene suggested she hadn't gone there on her own. It appeared someone ended her life elsewhere and dumped her body near Saltaire, likely hoping she would never be found. Naturally, investigators looked closely at the people in Nikki's life. Joel, her boyfriend, was scrutinized since he was the last person known to see her. By 2012, Joel was in prison in Washington for an unrelated crime. Detectives questioned him about Nikki's death, but he maintained his innocence and repeated that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He said they argued and he found her gone, and he has stuck to that story. So far, police have not charged anyone in Nikki's slaying due to a lack of evidence, though they haven't ruled anyone out. Another possibility considered by investigators is that Nikki encountered a stranger after leaving home that fateful night, someone who preyed on her vulnerable state. A random attacker with a vehicle could have offered her a ride or otherwise abducted her, then later driven out to the Saltaire area to hide her body. This stranger theory is difficult to prove, but it remains on the table for investigators. One eerie tip surfaced in 2012. A local cold case advocate received an anonymous phone call from someone claiming to be the perpetrator. The caller provided no details or proof and hung up abruptly. Police couldn't trace the call or confirm the story. The lack of detail, in essence, made it an immediate dead end. To this day, it's unclear if that was a cruel hoax or a genuine, fleeting confession by the actual responsible party. At present, Nikki's case remains an unsolved mystery pending further investigative breakthroughs. On April 1, 2008, 21-year-old Skye Budnick boarded a one-way flight from Connecticut to Japan and vanished, leaving her family grappling with unanswered questions. Since that day, her loved ones have searched tirelessly, straddling 2 continents in hope of finding her. Budnick was last seen on American soil at Bradley International Airport in Connecticut. But before I go further, it's important to know a few things about Skye. Skye Budnick was a junior at Central Connecticut State University, known for being extremely shy and deeply interested in Japanese culture. She had studied Japanese language and culture for 3 years and had long dreamed of visiting Japan, though previous opportunities to study abroad had fallen through. In late March 2008, without warning, Skye made a fateful decision to finally take that trip on her own. She purchased a one-way plane ticket to Japan and quietly left Connecticut on April 1st, 2008. Skye told no friends or family about her sudden trip. Not even her very best friends were aware she was leaving. She packed minimally for the journey, carrying only her laptop, necessary identification, a Nintendo DS, and her debit card, leaving behind nearly all of her other possessions. Skye's loved ones were caught completely off guard by her disappearance. When she didn't come home, her family grew concerned. Within a few days, on April 4th, 2008, Skye's sister Megan accessed Skye's email account looking for clues. In the email inbox, the family made an important discovery. The flight was from Connecticut to Tokyo, and then on to the northern island of Hokkaido. Alongside the travel itinerary, they found an unsent message saved in her drafts folder that indicated that she was in a troubled state of mind. The combination of Sky's secret departure and the contents of her email immediately raised alarm that she might be in imminent danger. Upon learning of Sky's one-way trip, her family sprang into action. Sky's mother, Susan Budnick, and sister Megan quickly flew to Japan themselves in an urgent effort to find her. By April 16, 2008, the Budnicks had arrived in Hokkaido and held a press conference in the city of Sapporo, pleading for the local media's help in locating the missing young woman. The family filed a missing person report with Japanese authorities as soon as they could. However, because Sky was an adult traveling abroad by her own choice, police were limited in how much they could do at first. Nonetheless, Susan and Megan were determined not to rely solely on official channels. They traversed Hokkaido following any trail they could find, doing media interviews, checking local accommodations, and passing out flyers about Sky's disappearance. During their search in Japan, the Budnick family managed to uncover a few critical clues about Sky's movements. They learned that Sky had indeed made it to Hokkaido as her itinerary indicated. She was confirmed to have checked into a small inn in the town of Noboribetsu, a resort area in southern Hokkaido known for its hot springs. The innkeeper in Noboribetsu clearly remembered Sky and provided what is now the last known sighting of her. According to the innkeeper, Sky was seen at the inn on April 7, 2008, exactly 1 week after she left the United States. She mentioned that she planned to travel next to the city of Sapporo. Sapporo is the largest city on the island, roughly an hour's train ride north of Noboribetsu, so it made sense that Sky might head there. Unfortunately, after that conversation on April 7th, Sky effectively vanished. She didn't check into any other known lodging in Sapporo under her name, and no further sightings of her were reported in Sapporo or anywhere else in Japan. The handful of leads that the family and authorities obtained unfortunately did not yield any concrete outcome. Japanese police and the Budnicks followed up on these leads, but there were no clues as to Sky's whereabouts beyond April 7th. She had no cell phone with her, and she made no known use of her debit card after arriving in Japan, leaving little for investigators to trace. In the months and years following Sky's disappearance, her case remained open, but progress was painfully slow. The story received only limited media attention, especially after the initial headlines in 2008, making it difficult to keep the case in the public eye. Sky's family, however, refused to let her be forgotten. The Southington Police Department in Connecticut maintained an open missing person file on Sky and periodically liaised with Japanese authorities. Importantly, they were able to provide DNA to the Japanese authorities to enter into a database abroad. Over time, several theories have circulated about what might have happened to Sky Budnick. Sadly, one of the leading theories is that Sky traveled to Japan as a final end-of-life trip. This idea stems from Sky's known history of depression and her own words. According to a news article from April 2008, Megan, her sister, indicated that Sky had previously spoken about traveling to Japan as one last thing to do before the end. The fact that Sky arrived in Japan, went to the most quiet and remote part of the country, and then disappeared without a trace, aligns with this theory in the eyes of some. If she did perish in a remote location, it's possible her remains were never found or never identified. However, without any physical evidence, the theory remains unconfirmed. If this is the case, there's also the possibility that Sky may be known as a Jane Doe in some area of Japan, and the pieces of the puzzle just haven't been connected yet. Another theory is that Sky may have fallen victim to foul play after arriving in Japan. As a young woman traveling alone with no local contacts, she could have been vulnerable to someone with bad intentions. Her family has voiced suspicions that someone online may have befriended or manipulated Sky into making the trip, possibly with an ulterior motive. It's conceivable that Sky might have arranged to meet an online acquaintance in Japan, and that this person harmed her or got her into a dangerous situation. Japan is generally a safe country with low crime rates, especially in rural areas, yet no place is entirely without risk. Further, this reputation for Japan being a very safe country could have backfired, and Sky may have had her guard down. It's also possible that Sky's disappearance was the result of an accident. Hokkaido's landscape is rugged in places, with forests, mountains, and cold seaside waters. If Sky ventured into an unsafe wilderness area, she may have fallen into a river or a crevice and simply never have been found. Importantly, early April on this northern island can still be frigid and snowy, and Sky was not equipped for extensive outdoor trekking by any means. And just to give you a sense of how snowy this place is, all the top snowiest cities and towns on Earth are located on Hokkaido. Further, the extensive snowmelt in the spring creates extremely dangerous river conditions. The accident theory can't be ruled out, but like the others, it lacks supporting evidence. A less likely theory is that Sky chose to disappear intentionally and start a new life under a different identity. While there have been cases of individuals who vanished to reinvent themselves, this scenario has little support in Sky's case. She didn't withdraw large sums of money or have the means to live comfortably long term. Further, some have speculated her extremely shy personality makes it doubtful she could seamlessly integrate into a new community without detection. Moreover, not a single confirmed sighting or trace of Sky has been reported since 2008, which one would expect if she were living openly under a new identity. Sky Budnick's case remains an open and heartbreaking mystery, and her family continues to strongly advocate for her, ensuring she's not forgotten. If she's still alive, she would now be in her late 30s. What if, like Neo in The Matrix, you discovered the life you'd built was nothing more than lines of code? That unsettling possibility isn't just Hollywood fantasy or science fiction. It's the core of a serious philosophical theory considered by top scientists and thinkers. Simulation theory, as it's now widely known, suggests our reality is likely an elaborate programmed illusion. This really is the ultimate mystery. That is to say, it's the mystery of the reality of our reality, and the way I present this theory may legitimately alter your reality in a positive way. Long before computers or digital simulations existed, thinkers were already asking whether the world as we perceive it might be an illusion. In Plato's renowned allegory of the cave, he describes people forced to watch shadows on a wall in a dark cavern and mistaking those shadows for the whole of reality. In ancient China, the philosopher Zhuangzi told a parable of a man who dreams he's a butterfly, then wakes up unsure if he's actually a butterfly, dreaming he's a man. These examples, both over 2,000 years old, capture a fundamental doubt. How can we be certain our life as perceived is truly real? Fast forward to 17th century France. René Descartes, grappling with the limits of certainty, imagined an evil demon deceiving him, crafting an illusory world of sensory experiences, and then jumped to the 20th century, where the concept was modified to the famous brain in a vat scenario. In that thought experiment, a living brain is hooked to a computer that perfectly simulates reality, so the brain doesn't know it's in a lab. Each of these thought experiments was a clue, a hint that what we take as reality could be something crafted or false. They laid philosophical groundwork for doubting the world that was evident all around us. The idea of a fake reality didn't only live in philosophy. By the late 20th century, technology itself provided new metaphors. In 1969, German computer pioneer Konrad Zuse, who invented the first fully programmable computer, proposed that the universe might be running on a vast computational framework. By the end of the millennium, the concept had burst into pop culture consciousness with The Matrix, a film so influential that I couldn't not start off this segment with a reference to it. Still, until the 21st century, this idea remained mostly a philosophical musing or fictional trope. That was about to change, thanks to a bold argument by a young philosopher that would bring simulation theory into the modern spotlight. In 2003, at the University of Oxford, philosopher Nick Bostrom cracked open serious debate on simulation theory. He published a paper with a provocative title, "Are We Living in a Computer Simulation?" Inside, he laid out a rigorous argument. Not that the simulation hypothesis must be true, but that we should consider it seriously. Bostrom's reasoning goes like this. Imagine a future civilization, perhaps thousands of years from now, with computing power vast enough to create simulations containing conscious beings. If human-like minds can be simulated by computers, then those future post-human programmers might run countless simulated worlds populated by billions of digital people. If even a single advanced civilization embarked on this project, the number of simulated minds would quickly far exceed the number of organic minds. And if that's the case, then statistically, it would be vastly more likely that we ourselves are among the simulated minds rather than the rare original real minds. Bostrom formalized this as a kind of trilemma, 3 propositions, at least one of which must be true. First, almost all civilizations destroy themselves or go extinct before ever reaching the technological capability to create such simulations. Second, even if some civilizations attain that capability, none of them choose to run simulations of conscious beings, perhaps for ethical reasons or lack of interest. Third, if the first 2 propositions are false, then we are almost certainly living in a simulation right now. In Bostrom's view, to not take the simulation hypothesis seriously, you'd have to believe either that advanced civilizations inevitably self-destruct or uniformly lose interest in simulations. The argument landed like a haymaker to the chin of academia. This was no mere idle speculation on a philosophy forum. It was a carefully reasoned paper in a respected academic journal. It gave simulation theory a logical structure and a measure of credibility. If one accepted Bostrom's assumptions, that consciousness can be generated by a computer and that future tech will be unimaginably powerful, the conclusion was hard to shake. And with that, simulation theory went from cyberpunk novels and hazy dorm rooms to academic legitimacy virtually overnight. Beyond conversation and conjecture, a few researchers have tried to put simulation theory to the test. In 2017, a team of physicists proposed experiments to seek out physical anomalies that might reveal our world's virtual nature. The idea is that if we live in a simulation, perhaps there are glitches or shortcuts in the underlying code. For example, at extremely tiny scales or high energies, the simulation might cut corners. One proposal suggested examining cosmic rays or the distribution of energies in particle physics experiments for signs of pixelation, analogous to the resolution limit in a digital image. These experiments are tough to carry out, and so far they haven't found any definitive evidence of cheating or rounding in nature's constants. But the very fact that physicists are devising such tests shows how the simulation question has moved from pure philosophy to the very edges of empirical science. Meanwhile, other scientists have taken a more theoretical approach to gauge the likelihood of the simulation scenario. And at this point, This approach has actually yielded much more interesting results than any actual attempts to test the theory. In one analysis, Columbia University astronomer David Kipping used statistics to update Bostrom's argument. He started by simplifying Bostrom's trilemma into two broad possibilities: either no simulated universes ever get created, or many do. With no hard data either way, he assigned equal prior odds to both scenarios, essentially saying, at the outset, it's 50-50. Then he considered the conditional chance of us being simulated given each scenario. The result? As long as we haven't yet created our own simulations, the odds remain about even that we are real versus simulated. However, if humanity ever does develop the capability to create conscious simulations, the balance would tip overwhelmingly toward us already being in a simulation. In other words, the moment we become simulators ourselves, the case that we're likely simulated gains huge strength. Kipping's careful approach put more concrete numbers to the intuition Bostrom gave in 2003, and many now believe whether we live in a simulation is essentially a coin toss. For all the enthusiasm, many thinkers are not convinced. Skeptics argue that simulation theory might be an intriguing idea, but it faces serious challenges. One objection is practical. Perhaps it's just not possible to create conscious minds with software and hardware, no matter how advanced. Bostrom himself acknowledged this. If consciousness requires biology or some non-computable ingredient, then digital people might never truly think or feel. Another objection is about civilizational behavior. Maybe any society advanced enough to run whole-world simulations is wise enough not to do so. Under this formulation, they may avoid the ethical minefield of creating a cascade of innumerable digital lives. After all, just because we could play God with whole universes doesn't mean we would. Though, of course, knowing human nature and imagining the power of such simulations to test literally anything and everything, I don't see any way we wouldn't. Then there are the scientific criticisms, and they're extremely numerous and quite well thought out. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Frank Wilczek has pointed out a puzzle. Our universe is exceedingly complex, full of wasted detail down to the tiniest scales of quantum physics. If someone were coding a universe, why include all those messy particles and galaxies billions of light years away that have no effect on us? Why would the bizarre interactions of quantum physics be a thing, rather than the sensible and intuitive interactions of classical physics? Wilczek argues that an efficient simulation would simplify or eliminate such unnecessary complexity. Yet our cosmos is intricate, which he feels is evidence against a simulation. Of course, the natural retort to this sounds very familiar. One can't know the will or desire of the programmer. This hasn't been lost on many, who see this as a simple reformulation of ancient ideas about the true nature of the divine. Other physicists have weighed in with another concern. It's not falsifiable. There's no experiment you can run that would definitively disprove the theory, because any result could be part of the simulation's design or lack thereof. If a hypothesis can't ever be tested or proven wrong, then it doesn't belong in the realm of science. By that standard, simulation theory becomes more of a metaphysical or theological notion than a scientific one. Intriguing, and perhaps true, but ultimately not verifiable. Philosophers, too, bring nuance to the discussion. Some note that simulation theory is essentially a new twist on an old problem known as philosophical skepticism. This is the challenge of proving that the external world is real and not a deception. From the butterfly to the evil demon to the brain in a vat, we've long recognized that we can't be absolutely certain our experiences aren't being fed to us. The simulation idea just replaces a dream state, or a demon, or mad scientist with a supercomputer. But in practice, we all operate under the assumption that our experiences do correspond to something real. We have to, in order to live. Therefore, many philosophers argue whether the universe is real or is simulated might make no practical difference to how we find meaning or truth. In fact, many have pointed out that even a simulated world would be a real world for those inside it. The objects and beings we interact with, even if ultimately made of bits and bytes, would still have substance and reality in a functional sense. If we accept this, a virtual kitten is still a cat, and its digital construction doesn't make it a mere illusion. By this view, being in a simulation wouldn't render life pointless, or our relationships fake. We still experience love, pain, joy, and beauty, simulated or not, and those experiences are real to us. So are we living in a simulation? Maybe we're organisms in a mindless cosmos, or maybe we're bits in some unfathomable computer, or maybe we're something else entirely. Either way, the sun rises, the seasons turn, and we find meaning where we can. The simulation theory, as fantastical as it sounds, urges us to not take reality for granted. It encourages a certain humility, an understanding that the truth might be far stranger than we imagine. For now, my advice is to not overthink it, stay hydrated, and get out there and touch grass. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just quickly reminding you to hit that like button and share this video with your friends and family. Also, if you appreciate what I do and you're in the position to comfortably afford it, consider joining up on the YouTube membership or the Patreon. Paris, the celebrated city of light, holds endless allure, but for some visitors it conceals a psychological mystery. Each year, a small number of predominantly Japanese tourists arrive in Paris with starry-eyed expectations, only to experience a severe and haunting disappointment. Their dream vacation unravels into anxiety, hallucinations, and paranoia, a condition known to psychiatrists as Paris syndrome. This rare syndrome is essentially an extreme form of culture shock, triggered when the reality of Paris fails to match the romantic image in one's mind. Paris syndrome first entered the medical literature in the late 20th century. The term was coined by Dr. Hiroaki Oda, a Japanese psychiatrist working in France, who observed this peculiar breakdown among Japanese tourists in the 1980s. Dr. Oda even published a book on the subject in 1991, bringing some initial attention to the condition in limited medical circles. For years it remained a little-known curiosity, but French clinicians took notice as more cases appeared. In 2004, a group of psychiatrists detailed the syndrome in a medical journal, describing it as a distinct form of travel-induced mental disturbance. They documented how affected travelers would arrive in Paris seemingly healthy, only to succumb to acute psychiatric symptoms. The syndrome manifests in dramatic ways, transforming a tourist's wonder into distress. Sufferers can experience a range of alarming symptoms: dizziness, sweating, anxiety, and even acute delusional states or hallucinations. Many feel an intense paranoia, convinced they are being persecuted or watched, accompanied by derealization, the sense that the world around them isn't real anymore. In severe cases, visitors have completely lost their grasp on reality. For instance, Japanese embassy officials have reported tourists becoming convinced that their hotel rooms were bugged. These tourists were certain that there was a plot against them, or even that the entirety of the city of Paris had been staged in a way to upset and disturb their reality. In one case, 2 young Japanese women were so terrified by these imagined threats that they had to be medicated and sent back home under supervision. In another startling episode, a man developed the delusion that he was King Louis XIV reincarnated. Another woman felt she was under attack from invisible microwave beams emitted throughout the city and from the Eiffel Tower. There have also been reports that some have come to believe that the city is a virtual world they're trapped within. This form of the delusion is thought to have seen an uptick since the popularization of isekai manga and anime from the 2010s onwards. For those unaware, this is a genre where the protagonist is stuck in an alternative world and can't get out. The aftermath of such episodes often involves urgent medical intervention. As mentioned, the Japanese embassy in Paris has occasionally had to step in, arranging for distressed travelers to receive treatment and even repatriating them to Japan. Also, as an aside, I suppose there may be an unethical traveler or two out there who decided to save on one leg of the trip, but in general, these cases are confirmed by psychiatrists. According to reports, around a dozen to 20 Japanese visitors each year become so disoriented and depressed by Paris that they require professional help. Psychiatrists largely agree that Paris syndrome is rooted in a profound cultural disillusionment. The condition has been described as a form of culture shock, when the idealized image of Paris collides with reality. Many of the affected tourists, most of whom have been Japanese, arrive in France with almost fairy tale expectations of what they will find. In Japan, Paris often enjoys a mythical reputation, a city of elegant fashion, romance, and artistic charm, as depicted in countless films and media. It's not uncommon for Japanese travel brochures and pop culture to portray Paris as a perfect dream city. The shock comes when the real Paris reveals itself to them. Rather than a postcard fantasy, they encounter a busy modern metropolis that can be indifferent, even unwelcoming. And while this may sound like a tired old joke, one triggering element is the customer service in Paris. What's considered normal service in Paris might seem exceedingly rude by Japanese standards. They're quite shocked when the customer service workers there literally don't care about tourists. After all, there's another million plus pouring in next week anyway. And that's not an exaggeration. Paris gets roughly 50 million tourists every year. Likewise, the well-ordered Tokyo subway system may seem far superior than the supposedly much classier Parisian metro. The general shabbiness of certain parts of the city plays into this sense of shock as well. The sort of tourists who are affected by Paris syndrome are the sorts of people who are shocked to find graffiti on the walls of this supposed fairy tale city. Further, the language barrier adds another layer of isolation. Few Japanese tourists speak French, and almost no one in France speaks Japanese to any fluency. So finding oneself unable to communicate can sharply heighten the sense of alienation. All these factors contribute to a feeling of meaning that's totally lost in translation, a destabilizing gap between expectation and reality. Moreover, the journey itself leaves travelers vulnerable. A trip to Europe is long and tiring, and visitors may already be exhausted and jet-lagged on arrival. This physical and mental fatigue can weaken one's coping mechanisms. When confronted with unexpected hardships, from getting pickpocketed to navigating confusing streets, a susceptible traveler's psyche can reach a breaking point. What starts as ordinary homesickness or stress can spiral into panic, depression, or hallucinations. Under this theory, Paris syndrome is a perfect storm. Over-romanticized expectations, stark cultural differences, and travel stress collide, resulting in an acute psychological crisis. That said, there's still much research to be done as to the causes of Paris syndrome. Out of the millions who visit Paris, only a tiny fraction are afflicted. For example, more than 1 million Japanese tourists travel to Paris annually, and only about a dozen or two cases are reported per year. Most people weather the culture shock of travel without incident, perhaps a bit let down, but not psychologically traumatized. Yet the syndrome's notoriety has grown due to those few extreme cases that defy our expectations of a normal vacation. It remains a kind of modern mystery how a simple holiday can trigger such bizarre effects on the mind. Whatever the case, medical professionals and casual observers all agree something real is going on in Paris, but at present, why that is, isn't fully clear. Deep in the dense rainforests of Sumatra, a mysterious creature is said to roam. Indigenous people have long told stories of a short, bipedal ape-like being known as the orang pendek. In Indonesian, orang pendek means short person, and this legend describes exactly that, a small human-like figure covered in hair, inhabiting some of the most remote mountain forests. And not to spoil this one, but there's a really good chance we actually do know what it is, and even though it's technically something ordinary, you're gonna be shocked. The legend of the orang pendek has deep roots in Sumatran culture. For generations, the forest-dwelling tribes of western Sumatra have spoken of a stocky, powerfully built little creature living alongside them in the jungle. Unlike many mythical beings, the orang pendek isn't typically regarded as a spirit or ghost by the locals. They traditionally considered the creature just as real as any other animal. Descriptions of the animal are strikingly consistent. The orang pendek is usually said to stand about 3 to 5 feet tall, walk upright on 2 legs, and be covered in short, dark fur. It's often described as having a muscular chest and arms, with strength so great that villagers say it can uproot small trees or snap thick branches. The creature is generally not seen as aggressive, and local tales say it avoids humans and will slip away quietly, though it may throw sticks or stones if threatened. Stories of the orang pendek remained relatively obscure to the outside world until the early 20th century, when Sumatra was under Dutch rule. During that time, a number of Dutch planters and explorers reported encounters with an unknown small wild man in the Sumatran forests. One of the first such accounts came from a hunter and settler in 1910, documented by the Dutch administration. In this report, a field overseer described seeing a creature about 40 feet away in the Barasine Mountains. And that's an interesting name for the mountain. You're definitely going to want to keep that one in mind as we go forward. It was walking low to the ground, running like a human, but covered in hair, and definitely not an orangutan. The face, he noted with astonishment, was not like that of an ordinary human, yet not quite like an ape either. More sightings by Westerners soon followed, each leading to more scientific interest in the creature. In 1917, a Dutch settler encountered a mysterious figure while walking at the base of a Sumatran mountain. He saw what he first assumed was a person squatting on the forest floor. The quote-unquote person had the build of a small man with broad, square shoulders. However, when the entity stood up, the Dutchman realized that it was a hairy, ape-like creature. After a brief and tense moment, the animal calmly walked away on its 2 legs, then lifted up its long arms and started swinging into the dense jungle. Numerous other reports followed, all following a similar pattern, and all those who saw it were sure it couldn't be an orangutan. Despite these early reports, interest in the orang pendek faded in the mid-20th century. The upheavals of that time period and Indonesia's fight for independence occupied everyone's attention, and the creature remained a regional curiosity. For decades, it was seldom mentioned outside of local folklore. That changed in the late 20th century, when a new wave of explorers and researchers arrived in Sumatra, determined to find out once and for all what truth lay behind the legend. Starting in the 1980s, interest in the orang pendek increased substantially, both amongst Indonesians and in the outside world. Despite numerous expeditions having been conducted since that time, no conclusive evidence of the creature has ever turned up. However, new anecdotal sightings continue. This has led to some asking, with so many stories but no conclusive proof, what could explain the orang pendek phenomenon? One theory is that the orang pendek is a real but undiscovered great ape. Those who favor this idea point out that Sumatra is home to rich biodiversity, including the Sumatran orangutan, gibbons, and other primates. The orang pendek could be a ground-dwelling cousin of the orangutan, perhaps an evolutionary offshoot that adapted to life on the forest floor. Its reported physical traits appear to support this. Witnesses describe an animal with long arms, a thick torso, and significant body hair, all of which sounds ape-like. Unlike orangutans, which are arboreal and found in northern Sumatra, orang pendek sightings are mostly from the western central regions of the island. Some theorists believe it's conceivable that a small population of a new ape species lives in isolation there. Supporters also note that as recently as 2017, scientists officially identified a new species of orangutan, the Tapanuli orangutan, in Sumatra's ecosystem. In my view, this is a bit of a mischaracterization, to say the least. The Tapanuli orangutan was very much known to science for almost a century and was simply reclassified as a separate species of orangutan in 2017. Another theory suggests that orang pendek might not be an ape at all, but a surviving hominin, a relative of early humans. This idea gained popularity after the sensational discovery in 2003 of Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit human species, on the Indonesian island of Flores. Those fossil skeletons revealed that tiny human relatives only about 4 feet tall lived in Indonesia as recently as 50,000 years ago, and perhaps even coexisted with modern humans. Under this theory, an unknown hominin species is what people have been seeing, with the hairiness generally explained by the fact that they may be wearing furs. But now let's finally get to the reason why this is truly a fascinating mystery. Skeptics offer simpler explanations for the orang pendek sightings. They propose that people in the forest may be seeing known animals, but interpreting them as something mysterious due to unusual circumstances. One candidate often mentioned is the sun bear, a small bear native to Sumatra. Sun bears, when malnourished or suffering from disease, can lose much of their fur. They can also walk upright for prolonged periods of time and at a surprisingly rapid pace. An upright sun bear glimpsed through foliage might be mistaken for a hairy bipedal creature. In fact, there have been cases of sun bears standing on 2 legs and startling observers. Their stance can look eerily human from a distance. In mid-2023, a viral video posted on social media captured Angela, a Malayan sun bear at Hangzhou Zoo, standing upright and waving at spectators with a human-like posture. Its sagging skin folds looked like a baggy suit, leading viewers both online and in person to speculate the bear was a person in costume. The rumors spread online, fueled by disbelief that a real animal could look like that and mimic such human gestures. The zoo was forced to release a statement confirming that the sun bear wasn't a dude in a costume being used to drum up publicity.